if you go back to the 1500s, you had the Spanish colonies and the French colonies in the U.S. that have their African slaves, and these are slaves that came from Cuba, from Haiti, and brought some of these things to the United States, but they were cut short. You know what I'm saying, once this becomes the U.S., once those colonies are ended, that attachment is no longer there. We're the ones that retain this, that we're allowed to retain. Attachment is no longer there. We're the ones that retain this, that we're allowed to retain. So this comes into New York City over 100 years ago. Then this impacts jazz. Again, this is where you have Dizzy Gillespie. This is where you have Manteca. This is where you have all this new sound coming up, a cross-pollination of cultures and music and sounds.
Chano also has this.
The year 1926 also brought a clear signal that others in New York City had begun to perceive Puerto Ricans as a racial minority and threat. A series of confrontations occurred in July of that year between Puerto Ricans and Jewish residents of East Harlem. The New York Times reported that these riots were the result of a rising level of resentment, anger, and fear on the part of Jewish residents towards the influx of Negroes who described themselves as Puerto Ricans. Jewish violence stemmed from a fear about any type of mixing with the mongrel population of Puerto Rican migrants. The important consequence was that this violent reaction to their presence provided critical proof that Puerto Ricans could not easily name or identify themselves. Puerto Rican organizational history itself suggests a real ambivalence in Puerto Ricans about their self-identity that was not evident in the larger society. In short, though Puerto Ricans found aspects of American culture useful if not attractive, the reverse was generally not true. There was little about Puerto Rican culture that other Americans felt drawn to. The sophistication and intellectualism suggested by the Puerto Rican cigar makers' use of lectures meant nothing to wider American culture. In fact, Americans knew little about Puerto Rican culture. This was made very clear by the public response to Puerto Rican music and film in the United States. In the 1920s and 1930s, when Latin music became a little popular in New York City in the form of Afro-Cuban music, the Puerto Rican element was totally ignored. Puerto Ricans got the attention of Americans only by being what they were not. They found themselves to be a subculture within a subculture, dancing to the Cuban and Argentine sounds that outsiders associated with all Latins. The results were that those Americans charmed by Latin music knew Cuban standards, like El Manicero, but were oblivious to similar romantic or nostalgic Puerto Rican songs that were extremely popular among Latinos themselves. What interest there was among Americans for Latin music was limited and shallow. Columbia Records, for example, was the first company to issue Puerto Rican music in 1918. These danzas and aguinaldos, however, were primarily produced for the foreign market in Puerto Rico and Latin America. This initial interest in Puerto Rican music, in any case, quickly waned. Table 2.2 shows, for example, that Victor Records, which also produced Puerto Rican music, did so sparingly in comparison to other groups. As of 1925, the number of Puerto Rican recordings in their catalog paled in comparison to that of West Indian music, although the West Indian population was only about double that of Puerto Ricans at the time. For the recording companies, Puerto Rican music was strictly marginal, a part of what they called the U.S. foreign market.
Ragtime traveled the great rivers of America, the interstates of the last century. It first surfaced south of the great Missouri in Joplin and Carthage and Sedalia and made its way along the river from Kansas City to St. Louis. Ragtime's weird and intoxicating effect, those were Scott Joplin's own words, soon became a shout heard round the world, and composers everywhere were infected with ragtime fever. My name is Maurice Perez, and ever since I became music director of the Kansas City Philharmonic, I have been fascinated with this Missouri Valley musical form.
Ragtime was at first dismissed as a curious expression of black Americans and stage minstrels, a vulgar fad that would quickly disappear. But as it evolved and adapted itself to the white majority, it took root and became sufficiently broad to embrace both Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag and Irving Berlin's Everybody's Doing It. Ragtime dominated American popular music for the 2 decades from the late 1890s until the late 1910s and was this country's first uniquely national style of music. Out of it came succeeding generations of popular song and jazz.
It was called Ragtime, and it would be America's most popular music for the next quarter of a century. Spread first by itinerant musicians, and then by the sale of sheet music, it was instantly popular with young dancers all over the country, who loved it all the more because their parents did not.
Ragtime is syncopation gone mad, and its victims, in my opinion, can be treated successfully only like the dog with rabies, with a dose of lead. Whether it is simply a passing phase of our decadent art culture, or an infectious disease which has come to stay, like leprosy, time alone can tell. Edward Baxter Perry.
There were Protestants, Catholics, Jews, and they all hated each other cordially, and there were no contact, or the minimum of contact, between them. And I was told by my parents, for example, don't you play with the little nigger boys. So, of course, I went out and hunted up every black child I could find. There was no mixing as such. The blacks had their own group, separate ghettos of their own. The Jews had ghettos of their own.
One of the few black musicians who was appreciated across ethnic boundaries was Scott Joplin, the king of ragtime.
It was, I think, the first urban American music. It was the first music that is really about the city more than the country. It's about the fact that after slavery, these Negro American musicians had a certain kind of freedom of travel that allowed them to go from one city to another. We're no longer plantation work animals. We're out here now as city people.
Black dance rhythms swept New York. They came as a wake-up call to the young Jewish immigrants as a new generation turned their backs on their Yiddish theaters. Now they wanted to hear and write American music. George Gershwin's parents bought a piano to improve themselves. Irving Berlin ran away from home to sell newspapers on the street and to turn their stories into songs. He called this new music by an old name, ragtime.
Ragtime presented to white listeners a new generation of dignified black performers, but it also heralded a new era of race relations. Young white ragtime fans used the music to help erode Victorian formalities regarding leisure and behavior in public. Middle-class white youth enjoyed rags in their home parlors and in leisure settings of all kinds, carnivals, circuses, restaurants, dance halls, and vaudeville. College students embraced ragtime as the sound of their unique brand of campus leisure, an early form of youth culture in the 20th century. Some middle-aged and wealthy whites also embraced ragtime.
Yes, that is genuine article. You know, some people refer to it as classic ragtime in quotes. Now, you're going to hear a lot of music in the next hour, all of which will be associated with ragtime in one way or another. And I hope you try to remember that what you heard on this pianola is real ragtime, and there are distinctions. Now, a good many years before World War I, ragtime was like a continuous soundtrack to the American scene. People played it, they sang it, and they danced to it. Good music for good years. Yes, indeed. Of course, we didn't take it too seriously in this country. But when ragtime went across the ocean, serious musicians over there like, well, Debussy, said right away that these people are making a new music. And it was these old ragtime composers that was doing it. Now, when I lived in Bloomington, Indiana, we had an upright piano in our parlor like almost everybody else. It was on the payment plan. My mother played ragtime. She played for vaudeville acts that came through town. Well, you could walk down Walnut Street past Belitzen's ice cream parlor, and the smell of caramel and chocolate was all mixed up with a ragtime tune coming from a pianola like this one, just lit up like a Christmas tree. When the circuses came to town, the calliopes played with a raggy tune. At the county fair, ragtime went round and round with the merry-go-round. You know, other towns like Bloomington have band concert nights, usually on a Thursday night. They'd build a bandstand in the public square in front of the courthouse or out in the park at the edge of town. And the brass bands would invariably play cakewalks and two-steps like this. Sometimes folks went on a trip to Indianapolis, and they'd come back talking about the good time they had in a beer hall where they heard songs like this.
Who that a knocking at the door below? Who that a shivering in the hail and snow? I can hear you knocking, Mr. Rufus Brown. Just keep on a knocking, boy, I won't come down. I'm here to tell you that you can't get in. You say you've been a gambling, honey, what did you win? What's that you tell me? You lost your breath? Well, I hope she freezes to death. Rufus, Rastus, Johnson, Brown. What you wanna do when the rent comes round? How you gonna pay? What you gonna say? You'll never have a bit of sense till Judgment Day. I know you know red means dough. Landlords wanna put us out in the snow. Rufus, Rastus, Johnson, Brown. What you gonna do when the rent comes round?
Of course, there were mighty few people in Bloomington who ever...
Ragtime gained national exposure at the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, its instrumental rhythms performed on and just off the fair grounds. By the 1910s, New York's Tin Pan Alley had become the northeastern center for commercial ragtime, blues, and jazz. Generally, the new music was not called jazz until 1915 or jazz until 1917, but had actually surfaced a few years earlier. Because of its association with sex, crime, insanity, and vulgarity, jazz and its precursors were considered morally suspect, and by the 1920s were charged outright as devil's music by critical black and white churches and press. Still, the music and the accompanying wild dancing became extremely popular among both races, finding their way to clubs, dance halls, and parlors across the country. Jazz, described as an instrumental imitation of the human voice, had largely overtaken ragtime upon America's entry into World War I.
From the dance floors of the big city.
You see, back then in the 1910s, ragtime was the rock and roll of its period. Young people danced to it. It was the music of the skyscraper. It was the music of modern America. In fact, one of Berlin's first hits was the clarion call, the anthem, the rock around the clock of ragtime. And the song, of course, Alexander's Ragtime Band. Why is it that? Because from the very beginning of the song, he's telling people to get with it, get with the new trend. Come on and hear Alexander's Ragtime Band. One of the essences of the popular song is the sound, the drive. It's just got a great inbuilt rhythmic feel to it. Come on along, let me take you by the hand. He's the leader of the band. At the end of the song, he does something which is very characteristic of the Berlin of those days. He quotes from an older song, and if you want to hear the Swanee River played in ragtime, very clever, because he's catching people by saying, well, you know, I'm not that new. I know about the past. And if you got to hear the Swanee River in ragtime, come on along, come on and hear Alexander's Ragtime Band.
The syncopated rhythms of ragtime really were something new. People had been used to popular music, which more or less aped, quote-unquote, high-class European music. And ragtime, with rhythms lifted from African-American music, really injected a kind of vivacity into American pop culture, which hadn't been there before. The hue and cry about ragtime, of course, was largely tinged with anti-black racism. Its jungle rhythms are forever being maligned. But also, there's a strain of anti-Semitism there because they're talking about sort of the Jewish song merchants who are pushing this horrible jungle music on America's youth. And there are really hilarious newspaper articles in which, you know, doctors and other experts are interviewed when they talk about how the jagged, syncopated rhythms of ragtime are going to drive everyone to distraction and what they're going to do to the central nervous systems of America's youth and how women are going to be sold into white slavery as a result of this music. So certainly this music was breaking through to the mainstream and was perceived as a threat as a result. There's been a pattern in American pop music mainstream assimilating elements of African American music, smoothing them out and selling them to mainstream white America, and moreover selling them to mainstream white American youth. And ragtime really was the first major musical revolution that followed this process. Happens again with jazz in the 1920s, and it of course famously happens with rock and roll in the 50s, and today it's happened with hip-hop, rap music.
The music business that flourished.
A number of military jazz bands gained popularity during the war. Perhaps the most well-known was the 93rd Division's 369th Infantry Regiment's Harlem Hellfighters Band, featuring Noble Sissle as singer and drum major under direction of Lieutenant James Reese Europe. The group became known simply as Europe's Band. Europe was born in 1880 Alabama to a former slave and a freeborn woman, both musicians, but was raised in Washington, D.C., since about age 9, until moving to New York in 1902. In New York, he first published original compositions beginning in 1904 and became music director for several musical comedies, including productions by Cole and Johnson. He founded the Clef Club in 1910, the first Black American musicians' union and booking agency. The next year, 3 years after its founding, Europe was elected second vice president of the Black Theatrical Association, the Frogs, serving with organizational president Bert Williams. In 1912, he conducted the 145-musician Clef Club Orchestra as the first jazz band to perform at Carnegie Hall, the Concert of Negro Music. And 1913 to 1914, performing dance music, Europe Society Orchestra was the first black orchestra to make recordings with a major label, Victor Talking Machine Company.
The Castles were a sensation, but much of their success was due to the all-black orchestra which traveled with them everywhere, and to its remarkable leader, James Reese Europe. Europe was a clergyman's son who was raised in Washington, D.C., where he squeezed violin and piano lessons in between the odd jobs he worked to help support his family after his father died. Europe's career took off fast. By the time he was 23, he was the musical director for black shows that had become the latest fashion on Broadway. And well before he met the Castles, he was the preeminent society orchestra leader in New York, playing for the Astors and the Vanderbilts.
The Europe gang were absolute reading sharks. They could read a moving snake, and if a fly lit on that paper, he got played. But the people wanted to believe that Negroes couldn't learn to read music but had a natural talent for it. So we never played with no music. I'd get all the latest Broadway music from the publisher, and we'd learn the tunes and rehearse them until we had them all down pat. Never made no mistakes. All the high-toned, big-time folks would say, "Isn't it wonderful how these untrained, primitive musicians can pick up all the latest songs instantly without being able to read music?" U.B. Blake.
James Reese Europe was not content just to play ragtime. He wanted more. He was convinced that it was his duty to reveal to the world what he called the musical proficiency of the African race. By working with the Castles, Europe saw his chance to bring his orchestrated version of African American music to a far wider audience.
The Clef Club, and later the Tempo Club, which Europe founded after resigning from the Clef in 1914, served as booking agent for black musicians in New York's hotels and cabarets. Europe's popularity led to a series of recordings of dance music that his orchestra made for Victor Records. It was one of the first contracts ever given by a major record company to a black musician and the first ever to a black orchestra. And when Europe's orchestra performed the Clef Club Carnegie Hall concerts, first on the 2nd of May 1912, then in 1913 and again in 1914, his personal reputation as a conductor, composer, and organizer not only elevated him but benefited Harlem as well. A reviewer of the 1912 concert captured the spirit of a delighted audience. It was an astonishing sight, that Negro audience, a sort of American balalaika, that filled the entire stage with banjos, mandolins, guitars, a few violins, violas, cello, double basses, here and there a wind instrument, some drums, eloquent in syncopation, and the sonorous background of 10 upright pianos corresponding in efficiency to the cymbalon of the Hungarian band. Europe uplifted his baton and the orchestra began, with an accuracy of attack that many a greater band might envy, a stirring march composed by the leader. It was the Pied Piper, again, for as one looked through the audience, one saw heads swaying and feet tapping in time to the incisive rhythm. And when the march neared the end, and the whole band burst out singing as well as playing. The novelty of this climax, a novelty to the whites, at least, brought a very storm of tumultuous applause. After that, the audience settled back with a broad smile of enjoyment. The Harlemites who clamored for tickets and the best seating at Europe's Carnegie Hall concerts shared Europe's pride in the acclaim from New York society and patrons of the arts.
We had a club here in New York called the famous Clef Club, where all the guys were thorough musicians. In order to join it, you had to not only be a great musician, your discipline had to be 100%, your character 100%, because we played for all the rich people, the classy people.
In 1910, a Broadway orchestra director named James Reese Europe formed the Clef Club, a booking agency and union for black musicians. From the cabarets to the concert halls, Europe's orchestras dominated the New York music scene and won new levels of respect and popularity for black musicians.
You have to recognize that the musicians that were in that group all came under the influence of James Reese Europe. This was all a part of what Willie the Lion heard, and he could see around him with the people from the various groups that were put together by James Reese Europe, that there was a melodic strain that he could tap into.
Willie called it beautification, the merging of light classical melodic and harmonic strains with the rhythmic pulse of stride. In this early sound film, Clef Club member Eubie Blake beautified a familiar tune.
When Willie was showing me music or playing, he mainly talked about how you should beautify a piece, how you should make it refined, and you should not bang on the piano, and you should use dynamics. The classical influence dispels the myth that these people were semi-literate or illiterate bums working in bars, and they didn't have any understanding of music outside purely instinctive means of performance. These people were sophisticated and were aware of harmony and counterpoint musical structure.
Eubie told me that the fellows in Jim Europe's band could read the spots on a snake's ass. They were so good at sight reading.
Blake also remembered that in the Clef Club orchestras, they sometimes had to hide the music to avoid disappointing white audiences who thought that the black musicians played by ear and couldn't read music.
James Reese Europe, a member of the group, organized the Clef Club in 1910, essentially a black musicians' union. This was the source of contact for dance orchestras of from 3 to 30 men for any occasion. In May of 1912, Europe's Clef Club orchestra of 145 black men gave a concert at Carnegie Hall. Several years later, one white member of the audience recalled the event and favorably reported her and the audience's reaction in the Musical Quarterly. Music-loving Manhattan felt a thrill down its spine such as only the greatest performances can inspire. There were many violins, violas, cellos, and double basses, but it was a motley group of plectrum instruments of all sorts and sizes: mandolins, guitars, banjos, and a few ukuleles. Then there was an indiscriminate assortment of reed and wind instruments. There were drums and tambourines, big and little, whose sharp accents danced across the jagged syncopations of the music, recalling the elaborate drum orchestras of Africa. There was an inspired timpanist. There was a huge bass drum, Curtis Berlin, Black Singers and Players, October 1919, pp. 501 to 594. Other unique features were the 10 upright pianos in 5 pairs and the singing as they played, string and percussion members. The man playing the bass drum and cymbals might well have been singing a high falsetto, while a first violin player sang a second bass. Despite reminders of elaborate drum orchestras of Africa, this group was distinctly American. Artistic credibility for a new-sounding instrumental organization, the jazz orchestra was in its infancy.
TV host or something. Next slot we're going to bring up is a photograph of
the photograph.
Clef Club.
This is a reproduced copy. Most of the things there are originals. But the thing about James Reese Europe, not only was he a composer, a musician, arranger, but he also, as Jason mentioned, was the first African American to actually play Carnegie Hall. And he actually played it with his 125-piece orchestra in 1912, 1913, and 1914. So you can imagine what that might have been at the time, because realize that America was only X years out of Plessy versus Ferguson, separate but equal as the standard. So to have an African-American band being invited to play at Carnegie Hall and to do such a phenomenal job, that's his orchestra at Carnegie Hall. Now, Jason often says that prior to the war, James Reese Europe was a string man. And this is a banjoline. I had never seen a...
For Americans, however, plena and other Latin music was only dance music, lacking complexity or real integrity. It was marginal music, enjoyed by a few aficionados only. It did not have the same resonance and penetration into the American musical soul and tastes as jazz did. Jazz musicians, however, were themselves often enthusiasts and practitioners of Latin music. Dizzy Gillespie and Tommy Dorsey, for instance, collaborated with various Latin musicians, learned Latin music styles, and helped to fuse the two. But it was jazz rather than Latin music that entered the mainstream of American popular musical developments. Unlike Latin music, Americans of all races and national origins played jazz. Getting into the American cultural mainstream wasn't that easy for jazz. Indeed, many white Americans rejected it because of its African American origins. Some simply couldn't warm up to jazz's syncopated style, which seemed to violate all of the musical rules with which they were familiar. They quipped that jazz could never replace the old-fashioned earache. But that criticism also suggests that jazz enjoyed a status never enjoyed by Latin music. Americans were engaged with jazz in a way they never were with Latin music. Collaborators, thieves, lovers, and haters of each other's culture, whites and blacks in the 1920s were, nevertheless, equals as opponents as often as they were friends. The criticism of jazz suggested that at least it was noticed. Puerto Ricans, however, were invisible performers of a marginal and exotic dance music.
Record label owner were in cahoots with one another.
Many people don't realize that are aficionados of this music that Tito Puente, Tito Rodriguez, and Machito were almost known to a certain extent as local artists.
All the noise now because of the Latinos who are like crossing over, you know. In those days, you didn't have to cross anywhere. You just met.
Tito Puente used to have conversations with me telling me about, yeah, when I was at RCA, the biggest record company in the world, they always treated me like I was some local artist. So you can imagine what that does to a person who has this incredible musicianship and this consummate band.
Every time they ask me, well, Tito or Mr. Puente, what do you think about crossover? Huh? I say, crossover? Man, I'm on my way back. What are you kidding?
So it was only natural for Tito to be frustrated and to try to get on the next level.
Jazz became the language of white musicians like Al Jolson and George Gershwin. All of this suggested that the Puerto Rican relationship to the larger U.S. society was not simply unequal but missing.
Rhapsody in Blue definitely broke the rules.
It changed the way classical music was heard in America.
I mean, it's an amazing piece to play. It's really colourful, it's really bright and atmospheric.
Like, it strikes a chord with so many people.
It's incredibly important in every aspect of its writing.
It is one of the masterpieces of American music. It's iconic.
Today, with the help of the BBC Scottish Symphony Orchestra, we're going to be exploring a masterwork of the symphonic repertoire. Talking to the musicians, we'll find out just what it's like to play before being treated to an exclusive live performance. George Gershwin's electrifying masterpiece, Rhapsody in Blue, is a landmark in 20th century music. For the first time, a symphonic piece written for the concert hall would have an unequivocally American stamp on it. Gershwin was a young man determined to prove himself as a serious composer beyond Broadway and popular song, where he'd already enjoyed considerable success. And as the blue in the title suggests, the piece would be unashamedly informed by the jazz music that was shaking up things in 1920s New York City. Living in Harlem, the epicenter of New York jazz, with famous venues like the Cotton Club on his doorstep, Gershwin was surrounded by the hottest new sounds in the city. Exotic harmonies and dance rhythms that drew in the crowds, even if they divided the critics. With one asking, does jazz put the sin in syncopation?
Rhapsody in Blue isn't just jazz-like in the way it sounds. It's jazz-like in the way it was made. It was written in such a hurry that Gershwin didn't actually notate all of the piano writing. He played the piano part in the first performance and improvised a lot of it. And that's not the only degree of improvisation that was there. The clarinet player, Ross Gorman, introduced the famous glissando that opens the piece. That wasn't how it was written, but that's how Ross Gorman played it. Gershwin heard it and went, I'm keeping that. Apart from Beethoven's Fifth, I can't think of a more well-known opening to a piece of music. If you've ever heard Rhapsody in Blue, you know that.
That's the bit of clarinet that everybody, Joe Public in the street, anyone will know.
Is it ever possible to hear how Gershwin originally wrote it?
I don't even know how it's written. Great ideas sometimes come from not thinking about it too much and just having fun with things. There are lots of versions, and some of them are very kind of gets on with it very quickly, like not making a big deal out of it. And some of the recordings, people are just milking it for all it's worth.
Do you think it's your responsibility to set the tone for the rest of the orchestra in this piece?
I don't think I would be as arrogant as thinking that. No, I mean, it's the bit that everybody's waiting for. And I'm not saying that because I'm a clarinet player, but everybody is. And even like my colleagues, and say, oh yeah, looking forward to doing Rhapsody in Blue, and I love that solo, that's great. And so, yeah, that's lovely, but thanks.
Let's do the opening.
The nervousness and the adrenaline pumping is what very often makes you play better. So it's whether sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work.
Pressure.
No pressure at all, just enjoy and relax.
We should appreciate this is really difficult.
Yes, of course.
But it's exciting. You want to make it exciting and cool, and not too square. I studied classical music and I play classical music. You want to sound a bit cooler than that. I think what is really cool is the arrival, and when the orchestra or part of the orchestra is coming in, it's kind of,
Yeah.
It feels like an elastic band, like those things you do for physio. Kind of stretch, and relax. It feels a bit like that. It's quite, it's quite fun.
So physically and technically, what's happening in a glissando?
Well, There are many ways to do it.
But essentially, you're sliding.
Yeah, well, there's 3 registers of the instrument. The bottom register, and it's not very fit for glissando because it's too low, basically. And then there's the kind of that area which is a bit rubbish on the clarinet. And then we go to the higher register, which is basically all the fingers back on. Mm-hmm. And then because we're working higher, it's much easier. Because even if you could do a glissando at the bottom register, there would be the problem of... And when we get here, the next note is that, full on. And well, there's no way you can do a glissando of that because it's kind of...
Yeah.
One technique is to do with fingers. Go. Just with fingers, lifting the fingers away from the hole slowly to...
Lovely.
That's fingers. But I don't like that. I find it's too dodgy. It's too tricky. Everything can go wrong. And what I do, and again, this is coming from mucking about as a kid with my clarinet, having fun with it. It's a bit geeky, but there you are. I drop everything in my throat and all that to flatten the note. So if we're talking about the arrival note, the concert B flat, C for us, I can go about a fourth down from that note. Okay. So that's, for me, that's the base of my glissando.
And that's without moving your fingers. This is all done in the throat.
Here, yeah. And then it's kind of mixing real notes, going up and then dropping that without being heard too much. And then you have the possibility of timing, depending on conductors, to know where she wants you to arrive. So it's kind of... If the conductor wants to milk it, I can milk it.
Although his musical genius is undeniable to us today, Gershwin...
What you get with Gershwin songs, however, is musical depth. You get unexpected melodies that don't go quite where you think they're going to go, and you get really unexpected harmonies, which are absolutely not the standard four-square thing.
After the clarinet's bold announcement of Gershwin's intentions to do something different, it swiftly falls to the piano soloist to remind us that Gershwin's inspiration for the piece came from the novel new harmonies sweeping across New York City. In that opening piano riff, what are the indications that this is a jazz piece?
Well, it's a particular mode of jazz, what we call blue note, and right away he uses a scale that is not a traditional scale, so that's the color that is needed for jazz.
With Rhapsody in Blue, Gershwin created a work that has become a staple in the repertoire for both classical and jazz pianists.
I'm sure if you speak to any pianist, they say it's a real milestone for them. And certainly in terms of where it takes the orchestra, how it explores, how differently we can play and accompany and interact, it's certainly incredibly important in every aspect of its writing.
Jazz was the voice of the age. It brought greater variety and richer orchestration to popular music, more subtlety and richer shading. The new rhythms were for dancing, and America was ready to swing with it. Soon the voice was also to be heard in the concert hall. Stravinsky, Satie, Milhaud, and even Debussy had begun to weave jazz into their music, and Gershwin, who had continued to study composition, set out to write a Lisztian Rhapsody incorporating jazz. In 3 weeks, he had written a work for 2 pianos with some indication of scoring. Whiteman's arranger, Ferde Grofe, did the orchestration, first for jazz band, and eventually adapted it for symphony orchestra. The historic concert took place on February the 12th, 1924, at the Aeolian Hall in New York. In the audience was a formidable array of social and artistic figures. Among them, Jascha Heifetz, Fritz Kreisler, Rachmaninoff, Leopold Stokowski, Stravinsky. Called an experiment in modern music, the program was to present jazz in all its various facets. As the long program progressed, there were signs of restlessness, even boredom. After 23 numbers, almost at the end of the program, Gershwin strolled up to the piano and sat down. With the first opening wail of the clarinet solo, the audience sat up.
What he did is he opened up the concert hall to the American composer. No one took American composers seriously, and most, usually you had to be European or dead, mostly both, So that he did that, and they said, oh, here's this very young, handsome guy, and he's suddenly an American composer playing concertos in Carnegie Hall.
What's so special about Gershwin is that his music appeals to us, and very often we don't know within the traditional fabric of musical life where to put it.
The actual first time the piano plays, it just plays.
And this is in that nighttime, lonesome world, which perhaps is best expressed in this piece, where everything is stripped aside, and you just have someone sitting in a back room playing. Now this little touch, that's from Chopin or Liszt or some other wonderful thing that he studied. But this is... has a simplicity and a directness and an honesty which is unprecedented in the world of concert music. There's just no adornment. There's just nothing. And he comes back to this again and again. Gershwin didn't consciously develop a tone of longing in his music. It was something which was there. It was in contrast to that whole up-tempo, jazz age quality. The longing quality, as has been very often remarked, was a synthesis of elements from Jewish music, from black music, from blues, from various elements of jazz.
The Rhapsody in Blue has seen many guises. It has been done in music halls, played by piano solo, solo harmonica, a mandolin orchestra, and sung by a cappella chorus. And in 1984, it opened the Olympic Games in Los Angeles.
Jazz made its way from the streets of New Orleans to the finest concert halls of New York and inspired George Gershwin to create this American classic.
It involves no less than 84 grand pianos.
As Gershwin's fame
Broadway and Tin Pan Alley. Broadway in the 1920s was a showcase for the sweeping changes transforming American culture in the early 20th century, including new roles for women, the mixing of social classes in new settings like Prohibition-era speakeasies and creative innovation by African Americans in jazz clubs and music halls. Sons of immigrants from Europe including the Gershwins, Irving Berlin, Jerome Kern and Harold Arlen made up a large percentage of the new word and music smiths writing for Tin Pan Alley and Broadway's musical reviews. Their syncopated rhythms borrowed from the jazz craze and their lyrics helped create a vibrant, witty new American argot. Tin Pan Alley and Broadway contributed such classic standards as Alexander's Ragtime Band, Berlin, I Got Rhythm, Gershwin and Gershwin, Old Man River, Kern and Hammerstein, Stormy Weather, Arlen and Kohler, Ain't Misbehavin', Razaf, Waller, Brooks, Anything Goes, Porter, and many more. These songs formed the musical backdrop of an era. The production of these songs also became big business. The first major book written about Tin Pan Alley was published in 1930 by Harvard professor Isaac Goldberg, and it was subtitled The Chronicle of the American Popular Music Racket. Goldberg's humorous use of the word racket captured something about the origins of the name Tin Pan Alley given to the music composed by poorly paid songwriters banging away in cubicles in downtown New York City on cheap pianos. The word also expressed Goldberg's view that the burgeoning music industry of his time was a slightly shady one. Our contemporary understanding of this music, on the other hand, is shaped by decades of nostalgic packaging that enshrines these popular songs as standards, comprising the Great American Songbook.
First thing about blackface is we have to understand that it comes out of minstrelsy. Minstrelsy was not invented to elevate Negroes. Minstrelsy was invented to get jobs for white guys who were imitating Negroes. The blackface is not just this performance mask. It's a rejection of his Jewish background and an embracing of American show business. So what we see there is that in a certain sense, blackface was also a window, if you will, through which Europeans could enter American show business. Now, what it became, ironically, was the first mass popular phenomenon in American culture.
Swanee was the first hit tune of the young George Gershwin. It was written in a section of New York, named after the sound made by so many songs being auditioned all at once, Tin Pan Alley.
This is not art music. It was never intended to be a very specialized kind of a deal. Oh no, on the contrary, the more millions it could sell in sheet music and then in records, the better off you were. And so they were out to deliberately create hits. That's what Tin Pan Alley physically was and what it mentally is. It's a state of mind of commercialized popular music.
And on the other side, there's another Gershwin tune.
George listened very much to pianists of that period, black and white. He hung around all over New York, and so he listened to people like U.B. Blake. He listened to jazz pianists and ragtime pianists of that time. The advancement of American popular music at that time is due largely to the Jewish.
In its own time, Tin Pan Alley was an insurgent popular music that was a challenge made by immigrants and then working-class children to the dominance of the polite middle-class, parlor music of the time. It also borrowed a great deal from the popular music being created contemporaneously by African-American musicians. Tin Pan Alley referred to an actual location where popular music publishers had their offices in New York City, first Union Square, then West 28th Street, and then further uptown. But Tin Pan Alley also meant a style of music that tended initially toward ethnic novelty songs and later, in the classic period, from the mid-1920s on, toward 32-bar love songs that relied heavily on internal rhymes and punning in the use of language. Such songs fed, and became the basis for, the burgeoning musical revues on Broadway. Tin Pan Alley music was urban music, and its initial popularity relied on sounds and themes that were perceived by white audiences as connected to African American life in the United States. Even so, opportunities for actual African Americans to get a hearing on Tin Pan Alley were quite rare. The heyday of Tin Pan Alley coincided with what African
composers, but also to the black influence.
You know, now some people might complain that if you were white, even if you were Jewish, you got a better shot than if you were black and were Christian. Being a black Christian in a Christian country didn't help you as much as being white if you were Jewish helped you.
American historian Rayford Logan has termed the nadir of race relations in the United States. While some commentators find evidence for intercultural sympathy in the sprightly rhythms, blue notes, and vernacular lyrics of Tin Pan Alley songs, it is also important to remember that the music flourished in a context of institutional racism. The rise of Tin Pan Alley, as music and institution, depended on the mass immigration of East European Jews to New York beginning in the early 1880s, and the historical shift of America's black population from south to north. Around the time of World War I, African Americans began leaving the South in droves. Ultimately, more people of African descent moved in the first few decades of the 20th century than at any time since the Middle Passage. What we now call Tin Pan Alley depended on a meeting of Jews and African Americans in the modern American city, where the two cultures interacted informally in neighborhoods, music halls, and businesses. The key Jewish figures of Tin Pan Alley, Irving Berlin, George Gershwin, Al Jolson, and Harold Arlen, to name a few, are consummate modern New Yorkers. Their careers were intimately wound up with their relationships to actual African Americans and with the sights and sounds of blackness. This was nothing new. Blackface minstrelsy had been the dominant form of American popular entertainment for much of the 19th century, and these Jewish artists were, on some level, the heirs of this tradition. It is no surprise that both Berlin and Gershwin had early hits with songs that made reference to the work of Stephen Foster, the most important songwriter for the minstrel stage in the 19th century. The popularity of the music of Tin Pan Alley depended on networks of production and distribution that radiated out from the music publishing houses to the Broadway stage, and to increasingly national circulation. Until the end of the 19th century, American popular music was presented in a series of overlapping regional scenes, with only occasional songs or musical forms becoming nationwide successes. The Chicago World's Fair of 1893 changed this. As historian Susan Curtis explains, this event provided the opportunity for ragtime to move from an almost exclusively African American and Mid-Western phenomenon to a national trend. There was no ragtime played at the World's Fair, but numerous ragtime pioneers, including Scott Joplin, played around town, and their music was carried from Chicago to the rest of the country. The first generation of Tin Pan Alley composers was obsessed with ragtime and its musical and commercial possibilities. They were also interested in repackaging the instrumental ragtime compositions that Scott Joplin and his colleagues had developed as the foundation for their own novelty songs. The decade of Tin Pan Alley's rise, the 1910s, might be usefully marked off by the debut of Irving Berlin's Alexander Ragtime Band in 1911 on one end, and George and Ira Gershwin's The Real American Folk Song Is a Rag in 1918. Both songs rely on audiences hearing the music as sounding recognizably black, while the lyrics tell tales of national triumphalism. The music of Alexander's band is so natural, after all, that it will make you want to go to war.
Once it got into the newspaper that way, it stuck.
Soon, Tin Pan Alley was credited with popularizing a dynamic new sound, ragtime.
And it was very exciting music. It had a great street sound to it, very much like rock and roll has, or at least rock and roll had in the beginning.
To me, ragtime was the beginning of this huge evolution of American music. It's heavily influenced from a part of the world that I'm from, the American South, this sort of left-hand stride piano technique, which one could hear in New Orleans probably in the 1860s and 1870s. And it has a huge African-American influence. There's a rhythmic influence that's not available to a lot of Western music up to that point.
The music itself ragged the notes, which is the expression ragtime came from. You took the note and you bent it. You slung it over here a little bit. You came back. Ragtime fooled around with music, but it also fooled around with words. And it used all the slang, the latest slang that you can have. It made up words, and people just loved it. You get, hello, my baby, instead of, your dearest heart.
If you refuse me, honey, you'll lose me then.
You just want a little short verse that says, I got a telephone and now I'm going to use it too, and go into the chorus. Hello, my baby. Hello, my honey. Hello, my ragtime gal.
Send me a kiss by wire. Honey, my heart's on fire.
So that the chorus becomes this exuberant, lyrical, very rhythmic expression, which sounds fresh and dynamic like a new century.
Scott Joplin, one of several African-American composers on Tin Pan Alley, became known as the king of ragtime. He went on to write nearly 40 rags. Maple Leaf Rag was his most popular.
Hello, my honey.
The men and women writing and performing the blues were ambitious. They used the latest media to bring their music to the public. It was New York, the capital of the new recording industry, that made the blues a driving force in popular music. Initially, the record business ignored black musicians.
You have to remember that in this period, in the teens and 20s, the money in songs was in publishing. It was not in recording. And Perry Bradford, who was a black songwriter, he was a contemporary and a competitor of W.C. Handy's, was writing these songs, and he wanted to get hits.
I can't eat a bite for the man I love.
In 1920, Perry Bradford scored a big hit with Crazy Blues, sung by Mamie Smith.
Now I got the crazy blues. Since my baby went away.
It's said to have sold 1 million copies. No one knows for sure, but what is certain is that it launched the blues as pop music.
Now I got the crazy blues.
In the early
The proudest day of my life was when Shuffle Along opened.
At the intermission, all these white people kept saying, I would like to touch him, the man who wrote the music. At last, I'm a human being. U.B. Blake.
The invention or the creation of jazz by black artists sort of gave this country a language that it was searching for and gave it a rhythmic identity. And so it makes perfect sense that the composers would use this invented language and rhythm for the theater.
A jazz show like no other arrived on Broadway on May 23, 1921. Produced on a shoestring with borrowed costumes and second-hand sets, Shuffle Along featured a rich, rousing score by Noble Sissle and U.B. Blake.
Ladies and gentlemen, years ago I wrote a tune called I'm Just Wild About Harry. I'll play it for you. I'm just wild about Harry. Harry's wild about me. I don't know the words, so I'll play the melody.
James Hubert Blake was born in 1883 and raised in Baltimore by a devoutly religious mother and a hard-drinking father. As a youngster, U.B. first syncopated church hymns on an organ, and at 15 he had a regular job as a pianist in a bawdy house. After World War I, he and vocalist Noble Sissle developed a vaudeville act called the Dixie Duo. When Sissle and Blake joined forces with another vaudeville team, Miller and Lyles, Shuffle Along was born.
Great comedic talent, great songwriting, and they're introducing a kind of romantic quality about black performers that had never before been seen on stage. Forget being seen, hadn't been allowed. There's a ballad that's introduced in the show, Love Will Find a Way.
Love will find a way.
Love will find a way.
First time was a love song in a Negro show.
Isn't that the song that they said that they couldn't afford to have in a Negro show because the Negroes didn't have romance?
Romance, yeah.
I remember that very well.
Yeah.
Oh,
Play
yeah.
the chorus.
Oh,
I don't
that-
know the verse now.
Well, that's all right.
Just
Sing the chorus
verse.
and I'll try to
Okay.
help you. Here? Oh, good.
Love will find a way.
Oh, I know it will, honey.
Though the skies are gray, love like ours.
This was profoundly risky, but it paid off. The song was a hit, and the precedent was set.
With Shuffle Along, and was still unquestionably a certain amount of minstrelsy still going on, but because it was created by black artists and performed by black artists, you saw the real juice, you saw the real spark. Not black performers performing white people's vision of black people. It must have been just an exhilarating thing.
Shuffle Along cracked open Broadway's doors to black talent. And for the first time, the orchestra seating in a Broadway theater included a section reserved for Negro patrons.
It is when the chorus and principals get going in the dances that the world seems a brighter place to live in. They wriggle and shimmy in a fashion to outdo a congress of eels. And they fling their limbs about without stopping to make sure that they are securely fastened on. New York Herald Tribune, May 24th, 1921.
Look out. Let him. Atta boy.
Shuffle Along was very popular. It was a very clever show, very fast-moving, lots of good dancing, of course. Ziegfeld had to pick that up, you know, because it was the talk of the town.
Ziegfeld is asking in the dancers and singers and performers from Shuffle Along to teach his own chorus girls.
Many, many people were influenced by Shuffle Along. Irving Berlin said he went back to see it many times, and there's no question that the Gershwins were influenced by it.
For nearly 2 years, it was always packed. Shuffle Along gave a scintillating send-off to that Negro vogue in Manhattan. It gave the proper push that spread to books, African sculpture, music, and dancing. Langston Hughes.
The unexpected hit inspired a spate of new black musicals, which in turn generated interest in Harlem nightclubs that featured a new generation of black entertainers.
Jungle, hit boy.
Harlem and Broadway are having a fine old time in the 20s. A lot of your top jazz performers, whether it's Fats Waller, Louis Armstrong, James P. Johnson, they are playing in Harlem nightclubs. They are also writing songs for Broadway revues and appearing in them.
There was this period in which, you know, everybody was sleeping across borders and boundaries. There was this incredible cross-fertilization, cultural appropriation. It's like in the 20s, everybody had permission to visit each other's lands and see what they were doing.
Broadway's most contagious contribution to the jazz age came from a black show with a white producer, George White. Runnin' Wild brought flapping elbows and bumping knees to the entire country with a dance called the Charleston.
George White liked to think that he invented 1920s dance. He liked to think that he was the guy that said, I've got this great dance here, here it is, the Black Bottom, the Charleston. So many of the moves that were associated with the 20s. Whether he actually invented these dances, the fact was he put them before the public in a way that the same way that you couldn't get a tune out of your head, you couldn't get White's dances out of your feet. That was what he did.
George White was one of the great review men.
George Gershwin wrote the complete scores for the George White scandals from 1920 to 1924, catapulting both the shows and Gershwin to stardom. Gershwin's irresistible melodies captured the excitement of the new metropolis and were influenced by the new music of the day. Jazz. Jazz had come up from the South and found its way to Harlem. There, it was part of a flowering of African-American music, art, and poetry called the Harlem Renaissance.
And downtown, the theater district, the white commercial ticket buyers were so fascinated by this new culture coming out of the Harlem Renaissance that they brought black talent down to Broadway.
Some of the new Harlem talent that braved Broadway was the composer-lyricist team of U.B. Blake and Noble Sissle. Cecil and Blake wrote an all-black musical called Shuffle Along, and despite huge financial obstacles, managed to get the show up and on its feet.
The black shows couldn't afford showgirls and dancers and singers, so they combined them. They made them one, the chorus girl who could sing, dance, act, and was attractive. This new notion of a multi-talented performer, which now we take totally for granted, was a real innovation from Shuffle Along.
Shuffle Along had a simple plot, but its jazz melodies, hot dance numbers, and sizzling new energy lit up Broadway like never before. Yet the authors of Shuffle Along had more than razzle-dazzle in mind. In the years before their show, blacks had been portrayed on stage as thieves or buffoons, a tradition begun during minstrelsy, when first white and then later black actors donned blackface and parodied the lives of African Americans. Nothing approaching an honest relationship had ever been attempted on stage. Now, for the first time on Broadway, Cecil and Blake included a tender love song between an African American man and woman, a tune called Love Will Find a Way.
Come, dear, and don't let our faith weaken. Let's keep our love fires burning bright.
In American racist theatrical tradition, if blacks sang a love song, it had to be a comic love song, because the thought of serious passion between blacks was taboo. Not in Shuffle Along. That was a serious love song, and the performers were actually scared. They thought they'd be pelted with tomatoes and oranges.
But after the song was sung, there was a silence and an applause, and they had to encore the song. Cecil and Blake, much later, they said, you know, we were ready to run out of the theater in case something happened, but we were glad it went well.
Perhaps even more groundbreaking than anything on stage was what happened in the audience. It was the first time on Broadway that African Americans were allowed to sit in the orchestra section, previously whites only. Shuffle Along played for 504 performances, nearly 2 years. Other producers admired Shuffle Along's success, and within 3 years, there were 9 black musicals running on Broadway.
The reviewers said, you know, white shows take notice. This is what the shows on Broadway should be like. They should have this kind of pep and verve. And so producers like Ziegfeld and George White hired the chorus girls to teach their girls the steps.
It wasn't only dance steps and music that were changing on Broadway. Stories themselves were about to be transformed.
Especially you, yes.
This is Thomas Waller, nicknamed Fats, the man who composed the music.
I'm through with flirting, it's you that I'm thinking of.
There is a delicious irony hearing him sing, I'm through with flirting. After all, Fats was one of Harlem's most notorious philanderers. He certainly knew how to turn on the charm. Fats Waller's cheeky song reflects the risque club scene where he shot to fame. The floor shows were raunchy and daring, the music irrepressible. There's little left now of that legendary scene, but singer and local resident Michael Mwenso has shown me where it all happened. So, this is Fats Waller world, eh?
Well, this is definitely one of the places we would have spent some time in. It was originally a movie theater. Big bands would play upstairs. Great Benny Carter would play. Bessie Smith played here. The great Billie Holiday played a lot of times early in the career here.
Really?
Yeah, this was a place.
The syncopated music, rocking joints like the Alhambra, lured many Broadway stars uptown to see the outrageous action for themselves. From Al Jolson to Fred Astaire, Mae West to Judy Garland, they all came.
They would say that as soon as 12 o'clock would come, midnight, you would see vans or truckloads of people coming from downtown, because this would be the place. The amount of speakeasies, house rent parties, clubs, bars.
House rent